It was just after sunrise when Nurse Susan Miller walked into the hospital for her early shift. The air was quiet, and the hallways were still waking up with the soft sounds of machines beeping and nurses checking charts. Susan had worked in the ICU for nearly 10 years. She knew the routine, and she knew how quickly things could change. She was pouring a cup of coffee in the staff room when the intercom buzzed loudly. "Code Blue, room 403, the voice called out. Without thinking, Susan dropped her coffee and rushed down the hall. She knew room 403. An older man, Frank Davis, had been admitted there the night before. He was a Vietnam War veteran recovering from surgery. His condition had been serious but stable when she left last night. When she pushed open the door, she saw Frank lying still in his hospital bed. The heart monitor beside him was flat. No beeping, no movement. He had stopped breathing. Susan didn't wait. She ran to the bed and checked for a pulse. Nothing. "Call the code team," she shouted to the nurse behind her. She climbed onto the step stool and started CPR right away. Her hands moved steadily, pressing on his body with firm, practiced rhythm. 1, 2, 3, counting in her head, focused only on saving a life. A few seconds later, a young nurse handed her a bagged valve mask, and Susan worked to get air into Frank's lungs. The room filled with people, but Susan stayed where she was, not stopping until someone said, "We've got a pulse." A faint beep returned on the monitor. Everyone paused for a breath. Susan looked down and saw Frank's hand twitch. Then slowly it moved and gripped her hand. His eyes didn't open, but he was still here. Someone gently tapped Susan's shoulder and said, "Good job, Susan." She stepped back, her arms tired, but her mind alert. She watched as the team continued checking Frank's vitals. Doctors gave orders, nurses moved around quickly, but the worst had passed. For now, he was safe. She left the room and leaned against the wall in the hallway, catching her breath. She didn't know yet that her actions would soon lead to questions. She had done what she was trained to do, to act fast and try to save a life. It was instinct. But just around the corner, her supervisor was checking the records. A file was being pulled, and a note was found. It was a dinner. "Do not resuscitate." And Susan, without knowing, had just gone against it. The halls of the ICU stayed busy, but in Susan's heart, a quiet worry had started to grow. She had saved a life, but would the hospital see it that way? The morning passed quickly for Susan after the code blew, but it wasn't the usual rush of activity. Something fell off. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had done something wrong. She had acted out of instinct, saving Frank Davis' life. But now the hospital's strict rules and protocols were coming to mind. After the team had stabilized Frank, Susan had briefly checked his file while she waited for the doctors to finish their assessments. She had noticed the word dinner on his chart, "Do not resuscitate," but it had been so small, tucked in the corner of the page. She hadn't thought twice about it, too focused on keeping Frank alive. Now it was becoming clear that she had made a mistake. The hospital's policy was clear. If there was a dinner order, it had to be followed. In fact, it was one of the most important rules. Not following it could mean serious consequences. Susan hadn't thought about the paperwork when the emergency happened. When the code blue alarm had gone off, it had been a rush of adrenaline. Frank was in trouble, and she had to help. In the heat of the moment, she had ignored the paperwork. She had saved him, but now she feared she might lose her job. Just before lunch, Susan was called to the office by her supervisor, Nurse Karen Johnson. Susan had a sinking feeling as she made her way down the hallway. The supervisor's face was serious when Susan entered the small office. There was no welcome, just a gesture to the chair. "Susan, I need to talk to you about what happened this morning," Nurse Johnson said. Her voice was calm but firm. "Of course," Susan replied, trying to keep her voice steady. She had already guessed where this conversation was going. "We've reviewed the situation, and we need to discuss the dinner order for Mr. Davis. The paperwork was in his file. You're aware of the hospital's policy, right?" Susan nodded. She could feel the weight of the conversation bearing down on her. "Yes, I know, but I didn't see it. I acted quickly, and I just couldn't let him go," she said quietly. Nurse Johnson sighed. "I understand, Susan, but the policy is clear. You violated it, and that's a serious issue. As of now, you're suspended while we review the situation further." The words hit Susan like a cold wave. Suspended. She had never thought that would happen. She had only tried to do what she thought was right. As she stood up to leave, Nurse Johnson's voice softened. "I'm not saying you did the wrong thing by trying to save him, but we have to follow the rules. You understand, right?" Susan didn't respond at first. She just nodded and walked out of the office, her mind spinning. She had saved a life, but now she wasn't sure if it had been the right decision. Walking back to the nurse's station, she felt the eyes of her colleagues on her, some sympathetic, others less certain. All she could do was wait and wonder what would come next. Susan sat in her small apartment, staring blankly at the kitchen table. The suspension was still fresh in her mind. She had tried to explain what happened earlier, but the hospital's rules had been clear. She had gone against protocol. The dinner order had been overlooked, and now she was paying the price. But something didn't feel right. As the hours passed, Susan kept thinking about that moment in room 403. She had acted without hesitation when Frank's heart stopped. In her mind, there had been no choice but to help him. But there was one thing that didn't sit well with her: the dinner order in his file. When she first noticed the word dinner written on the chart, it had seemed like an afterthought, almost as if it was tucked into a corner. She had barely paid attention to it, trusting that everything in the file had been properly checked. But now she was second-guessing herself. How could she have missed something so important? Her mind kept returning to that file, wondering if it had been incomplete. Maybe someone had forgotten to double-check. Maybe the paperwork had been rushed. Her thoughts became a blur of possibilities. She wasn't sure what had happened, but she needed answers. Unable to shake the nagging feeling, Susan grabbed her bag and decided to go back to the hospital. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she could at least try to understand what had happened. She was determined to find out if there had been a mistake with the paperwork, something that could explain why the dinner order had been overlooked. When she arrived at Street Francis Hospital, the building felt quieter than usual. The halls were empty except for a few nurses walking by, focused on their tasks. Susan made her way to the records office, hoping to find someone who could help her. Inside the records office, a clerk named Lucy was sitting behind the desk, sorting through files. Susan knocked lightly on the doorframe before stepping inside. "Hi, Lucy," Susan greeted her softly. "I need to ask about Mr. Frank Davis' file. I think there's been a mistake." Lucy looked up, surprised but friendly. "What do you mean? What mistake?" "I've been thinking about the dinner order on his chart," Susan explained. "When I saw it, it seemed off. I don't remember seeing a clear signature, like someone had missed something." Lucy frowned and pulled up the file on her computer. After a few clicks, she nodded. "You're right. There's a signature missing. It was never fully confirmed." Susan felt a weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't her mistake after all. The paperwork had been incomplete. "So it wasn't just me," she said, feeling a mix of relief and confusion. Lucy glanced at her. "It looks like someone rushed the process. The final approval wasn't filed correctly." Susan's mind raced. If the paperwork hadn't been completed properly, she might not have been in the wrong after all. It wasn't her fault that Frank's life had been saved. She had only followed her instincts. She thanked Lucy and left the office, her heart lighter but still filled with questions. Now she had proof that the dinner order hadn't been properly processed. She wasn't sure how this would change things, but she knew one thing for certain. The truth was starting to come to light. The ICU was unusually quiet after Susan's conversation in the records office. She had learned that the dinner order for Frank Davis had not been properly processed, and now the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. But even with that knowledge, something still didn't feel settled. She had done what she thought was right, but she knew the hospital would need to address the mistake. As Susan made her way back to the nurse's station, she couldn't help but notice the curious glances from her colleagues. Whispers filled the air as she passed by, and though no one spoke to her directly, she could feel the weight of their stares. She knew people had started talking about her, about the decision she had made to perform CPR on Frank Davis, despite the dinner. Some of the nurses she passed gave her sympathetic looks. They understood the difficult situation she had been in. They had all faced moments when they had to make split-second decisions without time to think about the consequences. They knew she had done everything she could to save a life. But there were also others who eyed her with doubt. They weren't sure she should have acted without checking the paperwork, even if it was an emergency. Susan paused at the nurse's station where Amy, a nurse she had worked with for years, was filling out some forms. Amy looked up and gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Hey, Susan," she said softly. "I heard about what happened this morning. How are you holding up?" Susan sighed and leaned against the counter. "I'm just trying to figure it all out, Amy. I didn't think about the dinner. I just acted, and now it feels like everyone's judging me." Amy nodded in understanding. "You did what you thought was right. Don't let anyone make you feel bad for that. I know a lot of people are talking, but they weren't in the room with you. They didn't see the panic, the heart stopping. You made the right call." Susan appreciated Amy's words, but they didn't completely ease the doubt in her mind. She still couldn't shake the feeling that she had broken a rule, even though the paperwork had been incomplete. The fact that someone had made an error in processing the dinner order made her feel a little better, but she still worried about what would happen next. Just as she was about to leave the station, the charge nurse, Carla, approached. Her face was serious, and her voice was low as she spoke. "Susan, can we talk for a second?" Susan followed Carla to the small break room, her heart racing. Was she about to be called in again for a meeting with management? Once inside, Carla closed the door behind them. "Look, I know you've been through a lot today," Carla began, her voice quiet but firm. "But word is getting around. Some people think you shouldn't have done what you did. You need to be prepared for a conversation with the administration soon. They're going to look into this." Susan felt a chill run through her. She had known the hospital would review her actions, but hearing it so plainly made her stomach tighten. "I just don't want to lose my job over this. I thought I was doing the right thing." Carla's expression softened. "You did. And if anyone understands that, it's me. But you need to be ready. Just be honest with them. Tell them what happened, and don't let anyone make you feel like you didn't act in good faith." Susan nodded, but the weight of the conversation lingered. She had saved a life, but now her own future seemed uncertain. The whispers in the ward continued, and she wasn't sure how this would all end. All she could do was wait for the next step, hoping that the truth would be enough to keep her on the job she loved. It was nearing noon when Susan returned to the hospital the next day, still carrying the weight of the previous day's events. She had spent the night turning over every detail in her mind, trying to make sense of everything. The whispers in the ward were getting louder, and though most of her colleagues had been kind, she could tell that some were skeptical of her actions. It made her feel uneasy as she walked through the hospital halls. When Susan entered the ICU, she was surprised by the level of calm. The machines hummed quietly, the nurses moved in a steady rhythm, and the patients lay in their beds, mostly unaware of the tension brewing around them. She found herself standing in front of room 403, where Frank Davis was still recovering. The elderly man was stable now, though unconscious, and his vital signs had improved after the code blew. Susan had intended to check in on Frank before her shift started, but as she stood outside his room, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, nurse." Susan turned around to find a man in a sharp, dark suit standing in front of her. He had the posture of someone used to giving orders, but his expression was calm. There was something official about him, and Susan immediately felt a strange sensation in her stomach. "Yes," she asked, her voice cautious. The man stepped forward, introducing himself in a measured tone. "I'm Colonel Benjamin Harris from the Department of Veterans Affairs. I need to speak with the nurse who worked on Frank Davis." Susan felt a mix of confusion and curiosity. "That would be me," she replied, unsure of what to expect. The colonel nodded. "May I speak with you in private?" Susan glanced around at the quiet ICU, where most of the nurses were focused on their work. She led the colonel to a small corner of the ward, away from the patients and other staff. Her heart was racing, and she wondered what this man, a military official, wanted with her. Had the veteran's family complained? Had there been some issue with her actions? Once they were out of earshot, the colonel spoke in a low, serious voice. "I'm here to clear up some things about Mr. Davis. We've been monitoring his case closely, and I need to let you know that you've done the right thing." Susan blinked, surprised by his words. "What do you mean?" I, I acted without thinking. I didn't even check the dinner order. I just did what I thought was best." The colonel's expression softened slightly. "Yes, you did what was best. Frank Davis is not just any veteran. He's a retired intelligence officer under special protection, and the dinner order on his file was a clerical error." Susan's mind raced as she tried to process what he was saying. "A clerical error," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. "But I saw it on the chart. It was clearly marked." "It was," the colonel agreed, "but it was not properly finalized. Someone in the system made a mistake, and we've been trying to correct it. If you hadn't acted, Mr. Davis' life could have been in danger." Susan stood frozen, her heart pounding. She had saved the life of a man who, it turned out, was far more important than she had realized. She had done the right thing, but for reasons far beyond her understanding. The colonel's tone became more serious. "We will be handling the matter with the hospital. I wanted you to know that we appreciate your actions, and you shouldn't feel bad for what you did." Susan let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. "Thank you," she said quietly, still processing the shock of the situation. The colonel nodded and gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Just doing my job, Nurse Miller. You did yours." As he turned to leave, Susan stood there for a moment, the weight of the conversation sinking in. She had saved a life, but not just any life. She had saved the life of a man who was a secret to almost everyone. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Susan. Her mind kept returning to the conversation she had with Colonel Harris. She couldn't shake the shock of learning that Frank Davis was not just an ordinary veteran. He was a retired intelligence officer, and his dinner order had been a mistake. It felt surreal, as though the whole situation had shifted in a way she hadn't expected. But as much as the revelation about Frank's true identity settled her nerves, another feeling crept in: the hospital's investigation. She had been suspended for violating the dinner order, and that matter was far from resolved. She knew that her actions had been a result of instinct. A nurse's first duty was always to save a life, but the hospital's rules were clear. What had seemed like the right decision to her could easily be seen as a violation by others. When Susan arrived for her shift the next day, she could feel the weight of the situation hanging over her. Word had gotten around that she had saved Frank Davis, and the rumors had already started. Some nurses had congratulated her quietly, while others seemed unsure. No one mentioned the investigation, but it was obvious that things were not as simple as they had once been. Susan's nerves were on edge as she arrived at the nurse's station. She tried to focus on her duties, but her thoughts kept drifting. What would happen when the hospital reviewed the situation? Would they understand the urgency of the moment? Would they see that she was just doing her job? At noon, her supervisor, Nurse Karen Johnson, called her into the office. The serious look on Karen's face made Susan's heart race. She walked into the small room, her palms sweaty and her mind running through every possible outcome. "Susan, sit down," Karen said. Her voice was calm but firm. Susan sat, trying to keep her composure, but she could already feel the tension in the room. Karen pulled out a file from her desk and opened it. "I've been told about the situation with Mr. Davis," Karen began, "and I know you acted with the best intentions. However, the hospital has to follow certain procedures, and the dinner order was overlooked." Susan nodded, keeping her eyes on Karen. "I didn't check the paperwork. I didn't think about it in the moment. I just knew he needed help." Karen's expression softened. "I know, Susan, and I'm not questioning your actions, but the hospital has a policy, and it has to be followed. There are legal and medical protocols that we can't ignore." Susan took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I understand that. I didn't want to break the rules, but I couldn't let him die." "No one's blaming you for acting in the heat of the moment," Karen said, "but we have to take this seriously. The review will be thorough." Susan swallowed hard, her voice shaking. "So, what happens now?" "Right now, we're continuing the review process. It's out of my hands," Karen replied. "But know that you have support. We all know you did what you thought was right." As Susan stood to leave, Karen added one last piece of advice. "Just be honest with them. Tell them everything. The truth will be your best ally." Walking back to the nurse's station, Susan's heart was heavy. She had tried to do the right thing, but now it was in someone else's hands. She couldn't change the past, and all she could do was wait. Days passed in a quiet haze, and Susan found herself trapped between the uncertainty of the ongoing investigation and the steady rhythm of her duties in the ICU. Each time she walked into the ward, she couldn't help but glance toward room 403, where Frank Davis lay recovering. It was hard not to think about the events of that day, and even though she had acted without hesitation, a sense of unease lingered. The whispers had died down, but the tension was still there. Some nurses had approached her in private, expressing support for the tough choice she had made, while others remained distant, unsure of how to view her actions. It wasn't just the hospital that was under scrutiny, it was her future as a nurse. The thought of losing her job weighed heavily on her, and she found herself questioning every decision she had made that day. On the morning of her final meeting with hospital administration, Susan could barely eat. She had tried to go about her morning routine as normal, but everything felt off. Her stomach twisted in knots, and her mind kept replaying the moments from that fateful code blue. Had she missed something? Could she have handled it differently? At the hospital, the usual buzz of activity filled the halls, but for Susan, it felt like everything had slowed down. The weight of the day ahead pressed on her, and she couldn't help but glance nervously at the doors of the administration office as she passed by. The meeting was scheduled for late in the afternoon. She had no idea what to expect, but she knew she had to be prepared. Her palms were sweaty as she knocked on the door, and the stern voice of hospital administrator Dr. Rogers called from within. "Come in, Nurse Miller." She stepped inside and took a seat across from Dr. Rogers, who sat behind a large desk, flipping through papers. The silence between them felt thick as she waited for him to speak. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, but she forced herself to stay calm. Finally, Dr. Rogers spoke. "Nurse Miller, we've reviewed your actions carefully, along with the information from Mr. Davis' file and the military records. The situation was complex, but after reviewing everything, we've concluded that you acted with the best intentions, given the circumstances." Susan let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "So, does this mean?" Dr. Rogers raised a hand, cutting her off. "However, you must understand the importance of following protocol, no matter the situation. In an emergency, it's easy to act on instinct, but our job is to maintain the highest standards. We cannot overlook policy." Susan nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She knew he was right. The rules were in place for a reason, even if they seemed rigid. "We are not terminating your position," he continued, "but you will receive a formal warning. You will also be required to attend a series of additional training on hospital protocol and the handling of their orders. This will ensure that you are better prepared in the future." Relief washed over her, but there was still a lingering sting in the back of her mind. It wasn't the outcome she had hoped for, but it was far better than losing everything. She had been given a second chance. "Thank you," Susan said quietly, trying to keep her emotions in check. "We expect you to continue being a strong member of this team, Nurse Miller. Just remember the importance of balance between your instincts and the protocols we must follow." As she left the office, Susan felt a mix of emotions. The investigation was over, and though it hadn't ended perfectly, it was a step forward. She had been given a chance to keep doing the work she loved. Now she would learn from her mistake and move forward, stronger and more prepared for whatever came next. The days that followed Susan's meeting with the administration were filled with a mixture of relief and reflection. She had been given a second chance, but the warning loomed over her like a constant reminder. The hospital had decided not to fire her, but the training and additional review of protocols weighed on her. She felt the pressure of being held to a higher standard, but she was determined not to let this experience define her. Work in the ICU continued as usual, and though the atmosphere had returned to a normal routine, Susan couldn't help but feel that something had shifted. Every patient she saw, every decision she made, was now viewed through the lens of what had happened with Frank Davis. She was more careful, more mindful, and perhaps even a little more distant in her actions. It wasn't that she had lost confidence in her abilities, but rather that the events of the past few weeks had forced her to think harder before acting. She spent her evenings studying the hospital's policies more closely, familiarizing herself with every detail of the procedures. The additional training she had been assigned wasn't something she dreaded, though. In fact, she welcomed it. The training was thorough, designed to ensure that all staff understood the importance of clear communication and following protocols, even in the most urgent situations. One afternoon, after a long shift, Susan sat down in the break room with Amy. Amy had been one of the nurses who had supported Susan throughout the whole ordeal. And now, over a cup of coffee, they were talking about what had happened. "You know, Susan," Amy said with a thoughtful look, "I think this experience has made you stronger. You're more aware now, and that's going to make you an even better nurse." Susan smiled slightly, though the weight of the situation still lingered in her mind. "I hope so. I just keep thinking about that moment with Frank. I did what I thought was right, but I also know I could have checked the paperwork more carefully." Amy nodded. "We all make mistakes. The important thing is that you learned from it. You saved that man's life. Not many people can say that." Susan appreciated Amy's words, but the doubt still hovered. She wasn't sure she would ever fully shake the feeling that she could have handled things differently. But the truth was, she had acted in the best interest of the patient, and that was all anyone could ask for in such a high-stress situation. As weeks passed, Susan found herself feeling more at ease in her role. The training had made her more confident in her ability to balance her instincts with hospital procedures. She was no longer afraid to ask questions or double-check things when she wasn't sure. And though the memory of the investigation and the consequences still stayed with her, it no longer felt like a shadow that hung over every decision she made. The hospital had moved on, and so had she. It wasn't that the past was forgotten, but it had become part of her growth as a nurse. She had learned a valuable lesson, one she would carry with her for the rest of her career. The ICU, like every other department, had its ups and downs. But as Susan walked through the familiar halls, she knew that she was ready for whatever came next. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she was stronger now, more experienced, and most importantly, she had the confidence to keep moving forward.